It was just another quiet morning in 1983 when a Soviet radar detected a
the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will center on John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, Fidel Castro. Now we begin. The morning, the world didn't know it was almost over. October 1962 did not begin with explosions. It began quietly. In Washington, the air was cool and dry. Autumn leaves drifted across sidewalks near the White House. Commuters moved through their routines. Secretaries poured coffee. Children boarded school buses. Newspapers spoke of politics, sports, and routine global tensions. No one knew that within days, the United States and the Soviet Union would stand on the edge of nuclear war. No one knew that a single decision, made in secret rooms, could end civilization. The Cold War had already been burning for nearly 2 decades. It was not a war of bullets between the superpowers. It was a war of fear, a war of ideology, a war of shadows. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the 2 dominant global powers. They had been allies against Nazi Germany, but that alliance did not survive peace. The United States believed in capitalism, elections, private ownership. The Soviet Union believed in communism, centralized control, and state power. Each side believed the other threatened the future of humanity. Each side built nuclear weapons. By 1962, both nations possessed enough nuclear bombs to destroy the world several times over. And yet, until October, something had always stopped them. Caution, distance, fear of mutual destruction. But then came Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. In 1959, a revolution led by Fidel Castro overthrew the American-backed Cuban government. At first, Washington watched carefully, then cautiously, then nervously. Castro aligned himself with Moscow. To American leaders, this was unacceptable. A communist government in the Western Hemisphere, so close to American soil, felt like a direct threat. In 1961, the United States attempted to overthrow Castro in a failed invasion known as the *** Bay of Pigs invasion ***. It was a disaster. The invasion failed within days. Cuban forces crushed the attackers. The United States was embarrassed. President John F. Kennedy felt the weight of humiliation early in his presidency. But in Moscow, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw something else. He saw opportunity. The United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, both close to Soviet borders. From Khrushchev's perspective, the Americans were surrounding the Soviet Union. Why should the Soviets not do the same? Quietly, secretly, Soviet ships began transporting nuclear missiles to Cuba. Not defensive weapons. Offensive nuclear missiles capable of reaching Washington, New York, and most of the eastern United States within minutes. But this was done in secrecy. The Soviet Union denied everything. And for weeks, the world went about its business. Until October 14, 1962. That morning, an American U-2 spy plane flew high above Cuba. Its mission was routine reconnaissance. The pilot likely did not feel the weight of history as he took off. High above the clouds, cameras clicked silently. When the photographs were developed, analysts stared in disbelief. long cylindrical shapes, launch pads under construction, missile transport vehicles. These were not guesses. These were Soviet nuclear missile sites. The evidence was undeniable. On October 16, President Kennedy was informed. The meeting took place quietly, no public announcement, no panic. Inside the White House, a small group of advisors gathered. This group would later be known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The photographs were laid out. There was silence in the room. If the missiles became operational, the balance of power would shift dramatically. The United States would be vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Kennedy faced terrible options. Airstrikes to destroy the missiles. That would likely kill Soviet personnel, possibly triggering immediate war. A full invasion of Cuba. That would almost certainly lead to Soviet retaliation in Europe. Do nothing. Politically impossible, strategically dangerous. Every choice risked nuclear war. And nuclear war in 1962 did not mean limited destruction. It meant cities erased, millions dead in hours, possibly hundreds of millions in days. Kennedy did not rush. For nearly a week, the American public knew nothing. Behind closed doors, debates were intense. Military leaders pushed for decisive strikes. Some advisors argued that hesitation would show weakness. Others warned that once bombs started falling, escalation might be unstoppable. Meanwhile, Soviet ships continued toward Cuba. Missile construction continued. Time was shrinking. Each sunrise brought the world closer to catastrophe. And yet, on the streets of New York, life continued. People went to work. Children played in parks. No sirens sounded. No warnings were given. History sometimes moves quietly until it suddenly does not. By October 20, Kennedy had made his first major decision. Not airstrikes, not invasion. Instead, a naval quarantine. The word blockade was avoided because a blockade is legally considered an act of war. A quarantine meant American naval forces would intercept Soviet ships carrying military equipment to Cuba. It was a bold move. It was also a gamble. If Soviet ships refused to stop, what then? Would American sailors fire? Would Soviet escorts respond? Would one miscalculation ignite the first shots of World War II? On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. For many Americans, this was the first moment they sensed the gravity of what was happening. He revealed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. He announced the quarantine. He warned that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. It was calm, measured, but unmistakably serious. Across the ocean, in Moscow, Khrushchev listened. The world held its breath. Ships were approaching the quarantine line. American forces were on high alert. Strategic bombers were prepared. Missile crews stood ready. The nuclear age, which had existed mostly in theory and threat, was about to be tested in reality. And yet, the most dangerous day had not even arrived. The day when a Soviet submarine captain nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. The day when a U-2 spy plane was shot down. The day when both leaders believed war might be inevitable. That day was coming. And when it came, the fate of humanity would rest on decisions made by a handful of men, in rooms filled with maps, telephones, and unbearable pressure. This was not a loud beginning. It was a quiet tightening of the rope. and the world did not yet know how close it was to breaking the line in the ocean. The announcement had been made. On the evening of October 22, 1962, Americans sat in their living rooms and listened as President John F. Kennedy calmly explained that Soviet nuclear missiles had been discovered in Cuba. Within hours, grocery stores began to empty. Some families bought canned food. Others filled their cars with gasoline. A few quietly wondered if they should build shelters. Most simply waited. Across the Atlantic, in the Kremlin, Premier Nikita Khrushchev received the news with visible anger. The American president had gone public. The secrecy of the missile deployment was shattered. But Khrushchev did not immediately back down. He could not appear weak. For years, the Cold War had been a contest of resolve. Berlin crises, spy planes, proxy wars, each moment measured carefully. Now, a new test had arrived. The United States Navy was moving into position. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, forming a wide arc across the Atlantic, establishing what Kennedy had called a quarantine around Cuba. The chosen word mattered. Blockade would mean war under international law. Quarantine suggested restraint. But on the open ocean, words mattered less than ships and weapons. American sailors stood at their stations. Guns were loaded. Orders were clear. Soviet vessels carrying offensive military equipment to Cuba would be stopped and inspected. If they refused, no one wanted to finish that sentence. Meanwhile, Soviet cargo ships continued their journey across the Atlantic. Some carried oil. Some carried machinery. Some, according to American intelligence, carried components related to missile construction. The critical question was simple and terrifying. Would they stop? On October 24, the quarantine officially went into effect. The line had been drawn. In Washington, officials monitored radar screens and intelligence reports. In Moscow, Soviet leadership received updates from their captains at sea. American destroyers reported visual contact. The distance between opposing forces shrank. In one room inside the White House, Kennedy and his advisors gathered again. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. No shouting. No panic. Just the weight of decision. Some military leaders still favored immediate airstrikes on Cuba. They argued that the longer the missiles remained, the greater the danger. Others insisted that diplomacy must be given time. Kennedy listened. He often asked quiet questions rather than giving loud orders. He understood something critical. Once a shot was fired, events might move beyond anyone's control. The first reports came in. Several Soviet ships appeared to slow down. Then, astonishingly, some began to turn around. They reversed course before reaching the quarantine line. The immediate confrontation at sea was avoided. In Washington, there was cautious relief. But the crisis was far from over. The missiles already in Cuba were still being assembled. Construction crews worked rapidly. Photographs showed progress. Launch sites were nearing operational readiness. Even if Soviet ships turned back, the weapons already delivered remained a threat. And then there was Cuba itself. Its leader, Fidel Castro, watched events unfold with growing alarm. Castro believed an American invasion was imminent. He ordered Cuban forces into full readiness. Troops mobilized. Anti-aircraft batteries were prepared. The island braced for attack. Inside Cuba, Soviet technicians and military personnel worked alongside Cuban forces. Communication between Moscow and Havana was not always smooth. Castro, younger and more revolutionary in temperament, was willing to risk confrontation. Khrushchev, though bold, was more cautious than he appeared in public. And Kennedy, facing political pressure at home, had to show strength without triggering annihilation. 3 leaders, 3 nations, one narrow path between survival and catastrophe. As the days passed, American reconnaissance flights continued over Cuba. High-altitude U-2 aircraft captured images of missile sites. Low-level flights roared just above treetops, photographing installations in detail. These flights were dangerous. Cuban and Soviet air defenses tracked them carefully. Each mission risked being shot down. Each pilot risked becoming the spark. Meanwhile, American military readiness climbed. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. It was the highest alert level ever reached in U.S. history, one step below full-scale nuclear war. Bombers armed with nuclear weapons patrolled continuously. Missile crews waited in underground silos. Submarines took position. The machinery of global destruction stood prepared. Ordinary citizens felt the tension without fully understanding its scale. Schools conducted air raid drills. Some churches filled with quiet prayer. Television commentators spoke carefully, aware that every word could influence public perception. In Moscow, propaganda portrayed the American quarantine as aggression. In Washington, officials described the Soviet missile placement as reckless expansion. Each side believed it was acting defensively. Each side feared appearing weak. Back-channel communications began. Letters were drafted. Messages passed through diplomats. But the situation remained fragile. On October 25, at the United Nations, American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted the Soviet representative, demanding answers about the missiles. In a dramatic exchange broadcast worldwide, Stevenson presented photographic evidence. The world saw proof. The secrecy was over. Yet even with public exposure, the missiles remained in Cuba. Time was running out. And somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, Soviet submarines moved silently. Unknown to American commanders, several of those submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. Their captains had limited communication with Moscow. They operated under extreme pressure. American naval forces began dropping small practice depth charges, not intended to destroy, but to signal Soviet submarines to surface. Inside one Soviet submarine, the heat was intense. Oxygen levels were dropping. The crew had not heard from Moscow in days. They did not know whether war had already begun. Tension built inside that metal hull. Decisions were forming. The most dangerous moment of the entire crisis was approaching. It would not occur in the White House. It would not occur in the Kremlin. It would occur underwater, in darkness, with a single commander holding authority over a nuclear torpedo. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, the world existed in suspension. Ships had turned back. Missiles were still in place. Armies stood ready. Leaders exchanged carefully worded messages. By October 26, 1962, exhaustion had begun to settle over the men making decisions. For nearly 2 weeks, they had slept little. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy and his advisors met repeatedly, studying aerial photographs, intelligence summaries, and diplomatic cables. Every new image from Cuba showed progress. Missile sites were closer to operational readiness. Time was no longer an abstract concept. It was measured in hours. In Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced his own pressures. He had taken a bold gamble by placing missiles in Cuba. If he withdrew too quickly, he would appear weak. If he refused to withdraw, he risked global destruction. And in Havana, Fidel Castro believed invasion was inevitable. He urged the Soviets to stand firm. He even sent messages suggesting that if the United States attacked, the Soviet Union should consider using nuclear weapons first. The temperature of the crisis was rising. Then came October 27. It would later be remembered as Black Saturday. The morning began with confusion. Two separate messages arrived from Khrushchev. The first was long, emotional, almost personal in tone. It suggested that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly promised not to invade the island. It sounded like an opening. But before Washington could respond, a second message arrived. This one was harsher. It added a new demand. The United States must remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Now the situation became more complicated. Did the second message replace the first? Was it an escalation? Was there division inside the Kremlin? Kennedy and his advisors debated intensely. Some urged accepting the first message and ignoring the second. Others warned that the Turkish missiles were part of NATO's defense structure and could not be traded publicly without political consequences. While this debate unfolded, events overtook diplomacy. Over Cuba, American U-2 reconnaissance flights continued. They were slow, high-altitude aircraft, vulnerable if targeted. Cuban and Soviet air defenses had grown increasingly frustrated by these flights. That afternoon, one of them was shot down. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. It was the first direct American casualty of the crisis. Inside the White House, the news hit hard. Military leaders immediately argued that this act required retaliation. An airstrike on the responsible missile site. It was, they said, a clear act of aggression. Kennedy faced a terrible calculation. If he ordered a strike, Soviet forces in Cuba might respond. If they responded, American forces might escalate. Escalation in 1962 meant something unprecedented. Nuclear exchange. Kennedy chose restraint. No immediate strike. No instant retaliation. It was a decision made under extraordinary pressure. But the dangers did not end there. On the same day, another U-2 spy plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska due to navigational error. Soviet fighter jets scrambled. American fighter jets armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles scrambled to escort the U-2 home. For a brief moment, American and Soviet aircraft, both capable of carrying nuclear weapons, were airborne in the same region. A misunderstanding. A wrong movement. A single nervous pilot. The outcome could have been irreversible. But perhaps the most dangerous moment of all was unfolding far from public view, beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Several Soviet submarines had been sent toward Cuba. Unknown to American naval commanders, each of these submarines carried a nuclear torpedo. One of them, B-59, found itself surrounded by American destroyers. The American ships began dropping small practice depth charges, signaling devices intended to force the submarine to surface. Inside the submarine, conditions were unbearable. The vessel had been submerged for days. Temperatures were extreme. Oxygen levels were falling. Communication with Moscow had been lost. The crew did not know whether war had already begun above them. Captain Valentin Savitsky faced a horrifying possibility. If war had started, and they were under attack, he had the authority to launch the nuclear torpedo. That torpedo was roughly equivalent in power to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If fired at an American ship, the response would almost certainly involve massive retaliation. Global nuclear war could begin within hours. Inside the cramped submarine, voices rose. Savitsky reportedly believed war might already be underway. He argued for launching the weapon. But Soviet protocol required agreement from 3 officers before a nuclear torpedo could be fired. One of them, Vasily Arkhipov, disagreed. Arkhipov insisted they surface instead. He argued that the depth charges were likely signals, not lethal attacks. His calm resistance in that overheated, suffocating submarine may have prevented the end of civilization. After tense deliberation, the submarine surfaced. The nuclear torpedo was not launched. The world did not know how close it had come. Back in Washington, as night fell on October 27, the crisis remained unresolved. A pilot was dead. Missiles were nearly operational. Demands were shifting. Military forces were at unprecedented alert levels. Kennedy gathered a small group of advisors once more. They made a decision. Publicly, the United States would respond to Khrushchev's first letter, the one offering missile removal in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. Privately, through secret channels, they would agree to remove American missiles from Turkey at a later date. The Turkish missile removal would not be part of the public agreement. It would remain quiet, hidden, a face-saving solution for both sides. The message was sent. Then came the waiting. The longest waiting of all. Would Khrushchev accept? Or would the next sunrise bring nuclear fire? The most dangerous day of the Cold War was ending. But the decision that would determine the fate of the world had not yet been announced. And millions slept that night without knowing that humanity had balanced on the thinnest edge imaginable. The message that stepped back from the edge. The night of October 27, 1962, felt longer than any before it. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy remained calm in appearance, but those around him understood the weight pressing on every decision. A U-2 pilot was dead. Soviet missiles in Cuba were nearing readiness. American forces were at DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. And yet, there was still no final answer from Moscow. The proposal had been sent. Publicly, the United States agreed not to invade Cuba if the Soviet Union removed its missiles. Privately, through back-channel communication involving Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, a second understanding had been conveyed. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey would quietly be removed within months. But that part would remain secret. If it became public, it could fracture NATO. If it remained hidden, it allowed both leaders to claim strength. Now the world waited for Nikita Khrushchev. In Moscow, the Soviet leadership faced its own fears. Military commanders worried that the Americans might strike at any moment. Reports from Cuba described invasion preparations. Soviet troops on the island were on full alert. The memory of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion was still fresh. No one in Havana doubted that Washington was capable of another attempt. Fidel Castro himself believed invasion was imminent. He had already urged the Soviets to consider a nuclear first strike if Cuba were attacked. His position was fueled by revolutionary conviction and a sense of being under siege. But Khrushchev was thinking beyond Cuba. He was thinking about Moscow, about Leningrad, about millions of Soviet citizens. He knew that if nuclear war began, there would be no winners. The early hours of October 28 arrived quietly. Radio transmitters carried coded messages. Diplomats stood by their phones. Inside the Kremlin, Khrushchev made his decision. He would accept the American proposal. He would remove the missiles from Cuba. He would do so publicly. That morning, Radio Moscow broadcast a message from Khrushchev addressed to President Kennedy. The Soviet Union, he announced, would dismantle and withdraw its offensive weapons from Cuba under United Nations supervision, in exchange for assurances that the United States would not invade the island. In Washington, the message was received with cautious relief. There was no cheering inside the White House. No celebration. Only a quiet release of breath. The immediate danger had passed. But even then, nothing was instant. Missiles still stood in Cuba. Soviet personnel still operated launch sites. American forces remained on alert. The withdrawal would take days. And until every missile was gone, tension lingered. In Havana, Castro was furious. He had not been directly consulted about the final agreement. He felt betrayed by Moscow. To him, Cuba had stood firm under threat, and now the Soviet Union was stepping back. He refused United Nations inspections on Cuban soil. The relationship between Havana and Moscow was strained. But the larger catastrophe had been avoided. Over the following weeks, American reconnaissance flights confirmed that Soviet missiles were being dismantled and loaded onto ships. Launchers were removed. Warheads were taken away. The quarantine was gradually lifted. Strategic Air Command reduced its alert level. The world began to exhale. Months later, quietly and without public fanfare, American Jupiter missiles were removed from Turkey. The public never fully connected that action to the Cuban agreement at the time. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had found a way to step back without appearing to surrender. But the crisis changed them. Kennedy had seen how quickly events could spiral. He had resisted pressure from military leaders who favored immediate attack. He had learned the value of measured restraint. Khrushchev had seen how dangerously close miscalculation could come to annihilation. He had gambled and narrowly avoided disaster. The crisis also revealed something deeper. Nuclear weapons were not simply larger bombs. They were civilization-ending devices. Human survival could depend on a single conversation, a single refusal, a single calm voice in a submarine. In the months that followed, both superpowers sought ways to reduce the risk of accidental war. A direct communication link between Washington and Moscow was established, later known as the Hotline. Arms control discussions slowly began. The Cold War did not end. There would be more confrontations, more proxy wars, more tension. But October 1962 remained the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III did not end with explosions. It ended with a radio broadcast, with a letter read aloud, with leaders choosing survival over pride. And most people never knew how close they had come. Children returned to school. Families resumed routines. Autumn leaves continued to fall. But history had shifted. Humanity had stared into the abyss and stepped back. The world would never again underestimate how fragile peace could be in the nuclear age. The secrets that stayed buried. For years after October 1962, the world believed it understood the story. Missiles were discovered. Ships were stopped. Letters were exchanged. The Soviet Union removed its weapons. Crisis over. But that version was incomplete. Behind the official statements, beneath the speeches and press conferences, the truth was far more unsettling. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III had come even closer to catastrophe than anyone publicly admitted. And for decades, many of those details remained classified. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy did not fully know how many nuclear weapons were already in Cuba. American intelligence had identified missile launch sites. It had estimated warhead numbers. But estimates were wrong. Far more Soviet nuclear weapons were on the island than U.S. officials realized at the time. Not just long-range ballistic missiles. There were also tactical nuclear weapons, short-range battlefield nuclear weapons. Weapons that could have been used against invading American forces if an invasion had occurred. This fact was not widely known until decades later, when Soviet archives were partially opened and former officials spoke more freely. If the United States had launched airstrikes or an invasion, Soviet commanders in Cuba may have had authority to use those tactical nuclear weapons. That single decision could have triggered immediate retaliation by the United States. Escalation would have been rapid, possibly unstoppable. Inside the Pentagon during the crisis, some military leaders strongly advocated immediate air attacks. They believed surprise strikes could destroy the missile sites before they became operational. They argued that delay only strengthened Soviet defenses. From their perspective, decisive force would end the problem quickly. But what they did not know was how many nuclear weapons were already present and how close they were to being used. Meanwhile, beneath the ocean, the story of the Soviet submarine B-59 remained secret. The captain had nearly launched a nuclear torpedo after American ships dropped signaling depth charges. At the time, U.S. naval officers had no idea those submarines were nuclear-armed. They believed they were forcing conventional submarines to surface. They did not know that one heated argument inside a submarine hull had nearly ignited global war. The officer who opposed launching the torpedo, Vasily Arkhipov, would remain largely unknown for decades. His name did not appear in headlines in 1962. There was no ceremony, no recognition. But history would later reveal how narrow the margin truly was. Another hidden danger occurred with American nuclear forces. Strategic bombers armed with live nuclear weapons were continuously airborne during the crisis. Missile silos were fully activated. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles were positioned. The system was designed for speed, but speed increases the risk of error. A false radar reading, a misunderstood signal, a technical malfunction. At several moments during the crisis, radar systems detected what appeared to be possible incoming missiles. In each case, further analysis revealed errors. But in an atmosphere already charged with fear, the potential for misinterpretation was enormous. The doctrine guiding both superpowers was called mutually assured destruction. The logic was simple and terrifying. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would respond with overwhelming force. The result would be devastation on both sides. Therefore, neither side should ever start such a war. But that logic depended on rational leaders. Clear communication, accurate information. The crisis revealed how fragile those assumptions could be. Even communication between Washington and Moscow was slow. Messages were transmitted through diplomatic channels and decoded carefully. Hours could pass between sending and receiving responses. In a fast-moving crisis, hours felt like an eternity. That realization led to one of the lasting changes after the crisis: the establishment of a direct communication link between the two capitals, often referred to as the hotline. Its purpose was not casual conversation. It was to prevent misunderstanding, to reduce the risk that silence or delay could be misread as aggression. The Cuban Missile Crisis also changed how leaders viewed nuclear war planning. Before October 1962, some military strategies assumed nuclear war could be limited, that escalation might be controlled, that targets could be struck precisely. But during the crisis, both Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev confronted internal estimates of casualties. Those numbers were staggering. Tens of millions dead in the first exchanges. Cities erased. Infrastructure destroyed. Medical systems overwhelmed. Fallout spreading across continents. The idea of winning such a war became meaningless. Even in Cuba, where Fidel Castro remained defiant, the human cost would have been immense. The island could have been devastated, and it would likely have been only the beginning. There was also another secret, not widely known at the time. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, the ones quietly agreed to be removed, were already considered outdated by U.S. military planners. They were vulnerable, hard to defend. Their removal was strategically manageable, but publicly trading them during the crisis would have appeared as weakness. So the agreement remained hidden. Both sides needed to preserve dignity. In the Cold War, perception was power. Strength was measured not only in weapons, but in appearance. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a case study in brinkmanship, the practice of pushing a situation to the edge of disaster in order to force a favorable outcome. But it also revealed how dangerous brinkmanship truly was. One misunderstanding, one nervous commander, one technical malfunction. The entire world might have changed forever. Years later, historians would debate who won the crisis. Some argued Kennedy forced Soviet retreat. Others argued Khrushchev successfully secured a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and gained the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. But from a broader perspective, victory was survival. No cities were destroyed. No nuclear weapons were launched. The line was crossed in tension, but not in fire. Yet the crisis left scars. Trust between the superpowers remained fragile. Khrushchev's standing within the Soviet leadership weakened. Within 2 years, he would be removed from power. Kennedy, less than 13 months later, would be assassinated in Dallas. The world moved forward. But October 1962 remained a warning. Civilization had balanced on human judgment, on restraint, on the refusal to press a button. And for decades, many of the closest calls remained hidden, locked inside archives and classified files. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III was not a single moment. It was a chain of moments, some visible, some invisible, all of them fragile. After the edge, when the last Soviet missiles left Cuba, the world did not suddenly become safe. There were no parades, no victory celebrations in the streets. Instead, there was something quieter, a realization. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy understood that the crisis had permanently altered the nature of the Cold War. Before October 1962, nuclear weapons had existed as symbols of power. After October 1962, they felt immediate, real. terrifyingly close. Kennedy began speaking differently about nuclear war. In speeches during 1963, he emphasized shared humanity rather than rivalry. He acknowledged that both Americans and Soviets loved their children. Both feared destruction. Both wanted survival. This shift was subtle but important. The experience of nearly losing everything changed his tone. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev also reflected on the crisis. Publicly, Soviet propaganda presented the outcome as a defensive success. Privately, Khrushchev knew how narrowly disaster had been avoided. He had tested American resolve. He had misjudged how strongly the United States would respond to missiles in Cuba. And he had seen how quickly military events could spiral beyond political control. One of the most important outcomes of the crisis was the creation of a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow. Often called the hotline, it was not a red telephone sitting dramatically on a desk. It was a secure communication system designed to allow immediate contact between the two governments. Its purpose was simple: to prevent silence. During the crisis, messages had taken hours to decode and deliver. In nuclear confrontation, hours are dangerous. The hotline symbolized something new. Not friendship, but recognition. Recognition that misunderstanding could end civilization. The Cuban Missile Crisis also led to the first significant nuclear arms control agreement between the superpowers. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed. It prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. While underground testing continued, the treaty represented a beginning, a cautious first step toward limiting the most destructive technology humanity had ever created. The crisis influenced military doctrine as well. Before 1962, some planners believed nuclear war might be controlled. Afterward, the scale of potential destruction became harder to ignore. Estimates suggested that a full nuclear exchange could kill tens of millions within days. Infrastructure collapse would follow. Famine and radiation would spread. The idea of winning such a war became almost meaningless. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction became more deeply embedded. The logic was cold but stabilizing. If both sides knew that any attack would result in total devastation, neither would initiate one. Fear became the foundation of peace. In Cuba, however, resentment lingered. Fidel Castro felt excluded from the final agreement. The Soviet Union had negotiated directly with Washington. Cuba, the nation at the center of the crisis, had not been consulted in the final decision. Castro strengthened Cuba's ties with Moscow, but remained wary. The island would continue to play a symbolic role in Cold War politics for decades. In the Soviet Union, the crisis weakened Khrushchev's political standing. Some within the Communist Party saw his gamble as reckless. 2 years later, in 1964, he was removed from power. Officially, it was described as retirement. In reality, it was a political dismissal. The Cold War did not calm immediately. There would be more flashpoints. Berlin remained tense. The Vietnam War escalated. The arms race continued. Both superpowers expanded their nuclear arsenals far beyond what existed in 1962. Ironically, the fear of nuclear war did not eliminate nuclear weapons. It intensified the competition. Each side sought second strike capability, ensuring that even after absorbing an attack, it could retaliate. Submarines carrying ballistic missiles became central to this strategy. Hidden beneath oceans, They provided survivable deterrence. The logic was brutal. Peace through guaranteed destruction. But beneath the strategic calculations, something human had shifted. The leaders who lived through October 1962 carried its memory. Those who studied it afterward treated it as a warning. Military academies analyzed every decision. Historians examined every letter. Diplomats referenced it in later crises. It became the model for how close humanity could come to self-destruction without crossing the line. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was restraint. During the crisis, both Kennedy and Khrushchev faced enormous pressure from military advisors. Both resisted immediate escalation. Both chose negotiation over attack. It was not weakness. It was survival. The Cold War day that nearly started World War II did not end the Cold War, but it changed its boundaries. It defined a line, a psychological boundary that leaders understood could not be crossed lightly. For ordinary citizens, life resumed its routine. Television programs returned to normal programming. Children played outside. Factories continued producing cars and appliances. But in quiet offices and military planning rooms, the shadow of October remained. Every future confrontation carried the memory of that month. Every alert carried the awareness of how thin the margin had once been. And somewhere in the background of global politics, the image lingered. Ships approaching a line in the ocean. A submarine commander hesitating in darkness. A letter read over the radio. A world pausing. The crisis had lasted 13 days. But its consequences would shape decades. Echoes of the brink. October 1962 did not end the danger. It only revealed it. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders on both sides publicly emphasized stability. Privately, military planners continued preparing for the worst. The Cold War did not cool, it evolved. The memory of the crisis became a silent presence in every future confrontation. In Washington, policymakers often asked a quiet question during tense moments. Is this another Cuba? In Moscow, the same thought lingered. Is this worth risking everything? The fear born during the Cuban Missile Crisis became a reference point, a warning sign embedded in strategic thinking. And yet, despite that warning, the world would come dangerously close again. In 1967, during the Six-Day War in the Middle East, both American and Soviet forces increased readiness. Miscommunication and regional conflict threatened to pull superpowers into direct confrontation. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, tensions escalated sharply. At one point, the United States raised its nuclear alert level when intelligence suggested possible Soviet intervention. Once again, the shadow of escalation loomed. But perhaps the closest echo of October 1962 came 2 decades later. In 1983, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were severely strained. The Soviet leadership, deeply suspicious of American intentions, feared a surprise nuclear strike. Earlier that year, a Korean passenger jet, Korean Airlines Flight 7, had been shot down by Soviet fighters after straying into Soviet airspace, killing all aboard. The incident intensified distrust. Then, in November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. To Western planners, it was a routine command post exercise simulating nuclear procedures. To Soviet intelligence, it appeared potentially real. The exercise included new levels of realism, encrypted communications, participation by high-ranking officials, and simulated nuclear release procedures. Inside the Kremlin, fear grew. Some Soviet officials believed the exercise might be cover for an actual first strike. Nuclear forces were placed on higher alert. The world once again approached a dangerous misunderstanding. Unlike 1962, there was no public awareness, no televised speeches, no visible naval quarantine. The danger was hidden inside intelligence assessments and military readiness levels. Only years later did historians fully understand how seriously Soviet leaders had interpreted the exercise. The lesson from October 1962 had not been forgotten, but fear could still distort perception. The structure of deterrence remained fragile. The Cold War system depended on rational calculation. But rationality is shaped by information, and information can be flawed. In September 1983, just weeks before Able Archer, a Soviet early warning system falsely reported incoming American missiles. Inside a Soviet command center, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov faced a decision. The computer indicated a launch. Protocol suggested reporting it immediately as an attack. Petrov hesitated. He reasoned that a real American first strike would likely involve more than a handful of missiles. He judged the alert to be a false alarm. He was correct. A satellite malfunction had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds. Had he followed procedure without hesitation, the report could have triggered escalation. Once again, human judgment prevented catastrophe. The Cold War produced many such moments. Moments when systems failed. Moments when technology misled. Moments when individuals chose caution over reaction. Each of these moments carried echoes of October 1962. The original crisis had taught leaders that miscalculation was as dangerous as aggression. It showed that military momentum can outrun political intention. It revealed how quickly events could narrow into a single irreversible decision. Over time, arms control agreements expanded. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks led to the SALT treaties. Later, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty eliminated entire classes of missiles. These agreements were not born of trust. They were born of fear. Fear rooted in lived experience. The experience of ships approaching a quarantine line. Of missiles photographed in the Caribbean sun. Of submarines preparing weapons in dark, overheated hulls. As the 1980s progressed, tensions eventually eased. Reforms inside the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev reshaped the political landscape. Dialogue increased. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended without a direct nuclear exchange between the superpowers. But its end did not erase its lessons. Nuclear weapons still exist. Deterrence still operates. The structure built during the Cold War remains part of global security architecture. And the memory of October 1962 remains central to understanding that system. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III became more than a historical event. It became a benchmark, a warning embedded in diplomatic culture, a reminder that pride, fear, and misinterpretation can bring humanity to the edge. History often focuses on battles that happened, but sometimes the most important moments are the ones that almost happened. Moments when restraint triumphed over impulse, when leaders resisted the pressure of escalation, when a torpedo was not launched, when a retaliatory strike was not ordered, when a letter was chosen over a bomb. The crisis of 1962 was not the last dangerous moment of the Cold War, but it was the clearest demonstration of how fragile peace can be in a nuclear world. And long after the Soviet Union disappeared from maps, that lesson continued to echo inside the minds of the men at the edge. History often describes crises in terms of ships, missiles, and troop movements. But the Cuban confrontation was not controlled by machines. It was controlled by human beings. Tired human beings. Men with pride, fear, ambition, and doubt. To understand how the world nearly entered World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is necessary to look inside the psychology of the three central leaders. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy was only 45 years old. He had been in office less than 2 years. He carried the memory of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion ***, an operation approved early in his presidency that ended in embarrassment. Many military officials questioned his toughness after that event. Some believed he had hesitated too much. Some believed he had interfered too much. By October 1962, Kennedy understood that another perceived failure could weaken American credibility around the world. The Cold War was not just about weapons. It was about perception. If the United States allowed Soviet nuclear missiles to remain in Cuba, it might signal weakness to allies and adversaries alike. NATO partners might question American protection. Neutral nations might shift toward Moscow. Kennedy faced pressure not only from the military, but from political reality. He had congressional elections approaching. He had critics who accused him of being soft on communism. And yet, he also understood the horror of nuclear war. Privately, he had read casualty estimates. He knew that escalation could mean tens of millions dead. His challenge was balancing strength with survival. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev faced a different psychological landscape. He had risen through the brutal internal politics of the Soviet system. He had survived Stalin's era. He had overseen de-Stalinization. He believed in bold gestures. Placing missiles in Cuba was, in his mind, a strategic masterstroke. The United States had missiles in Turkey and Italy. Why should the Soviet Union not respond symmetrically? But Khrushchev also had personal insecurities. He worried about appearing weak before the Presidium. He worried about China criticizing Soviet caution. He worried about internal rivals waiting for missteps. Backing down too quickly could cost him authority. Standing firm too long could cost him everything. In Havana, Fidel Castro approached the crisis from yet another mindset. He led a small island nation that had already faced invasion attempts. He believed the United States sought regime change. For Castro, survival was immediate. Revolutionary identity shaped his thinking. He was willing to endure extreme risk to defend Cuba's sovereignty. Unlike Kennedy and Khrushchev, Castro did not command a vast nuclear superpower. He commanded a vulnerable island. His psychology leaned toward defiance. He viewed compromise differently. These three leaders were not irrational, but they were human. And human beings are influenced by pressure. During the crisis, sleep deprivation affected decision-making. Meetings stretched late into the night. Information arrived incomplete. Intelligence was sometimes contradictory. Advisors debated fiercely. Inside Kennedy's executive committee, some members strongly pushed for immediate airstrikes. Others warned of escalation. Group dynamics mattered. Kennedy intentionally structured discussions to avoid dominance by the loudest voices. He sometimes left the room to allow freer debate. He encouraged dissent. He asked questions rather than issuing instant commands. This style reduced the risk of groupthink, the tendency of decision-making groups to converge too quickly on a single course of action. Khrushchev faced his own internal pressures. Soviet decision-making was less transparent. Military commanders often favored strong responses. Information from Cuba arrived through filtered channels. He had to interpret Kennedy's intentions without direct conversation. Both men operated with limited understanding of the other's internal constraints. Fear shaped interpretation. When American leaders saw Soviet missiles in Cuba, they interpreted it as aggression. When Soviet leaders saw American missiles in Turkey, they interpreted it as encirclement. Each side believed it was responding defensively. This psychological mirror effect increased danger. There is another factor rarely discussed in public memory: ego. National pride played a significant role. Neither leader wanted to appear humiliated. Public retreat without visible gain could weaken domestic authority. That is why the quiet agreement regarding American missiles in Turkey remained secret. It allowed Khrushchev to claim that security assurances were achieved. It allowed Kennedy to claim firmness. Both preserved face. Face-saving measures often determine whether crises escalate or resolve. The crisis also demonstrated how perception of time influences behavior. Military leaders often operate under urgency. Political leaders sometimes require patience. During October 1962, time pressure increased the temptation for preemptive action. If missiles became operational, options narrowed. If an invasion began, escalation might be immediate. But Kennedy chose incremental steps, first the quarantine, then negotiation. This slowed the tempo. It allowed space for reflection. On the Soviet side, Khrushchev's decision to broadcast his acceptance publicly on October 28 was psychologically significant. It ended ambiguity. It committed the Soviet Union openly. It reduced the chance of misinterpretation. Leadership under nuclear pressure requires emotional control. Moments of anger could not dictate action. Moments of pride could not override caution. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of October 1962 is not that leaders were strong. It is that they were restrained. They resisted worst-case assumptions. They allowed room for diplomacy. They tolerated criticism from hawkish advisors. They endured accusations of weakness. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III was shaped not only by strategy and weapons, but by personality and perception. History often reduces events to simple narratives. But survival in October 1962 depended on complex human psychology. Fatigue, fear, calculation, doubt, restraint. In the end, the most powerful weapons were not missiles. They were decisions. If the first missile had flown. By late October 1962, both superpowers had detailed plans for nuclear war. These were not vague outlines. They were specific, timed, sequenced. If the Cuban confrontation had crossed the final line, those plans would have activated within minutes. To understand how close the world came, it is necessary to look at what would likely have happened next. Inside the Pentagon, American nuclear war planning centered around a strategy known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP. It was the blueprint for large-scale nuclear retaliation. If the Soviet Union launched a nuclear strike, Whether from Cuba or elsewhere, the response would not have been limited to a single target. It would have been massive. American bombers, land-based missiles, and submarine-launched missiles would have struck military bases, missile fields, air defenses, industrial centers, and major cities across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The doctrine was built on overwhelming force. The goal was to eliminate the enemy's ability to retaliate. But because both sides possessed large arsenals, total elimination was unlikely. Retaliation would follow. In October 1962, the United States had strategic bombers already airborne, armed with nuclear weapons. Missiles were fueled. Submarines were positioned. Strategic Air Command stood at DEFCON 2, one step below maximum readiness. On the Soviet side, nuclear forces were also prepared. Though the Soviet arsenal in 1962 was smaller and less technologically advanced than it would later become, it was still devastating. Intercontinental ballistic missiles could reach American cities. Long-range bombers could cross polar routes. And in Cuba, medium-range ballistic missiles were nearing operational readiness. If one of those Cuban missiles had launched toward Washington, the timeline would have been short. Detection systems would identify the launch. Decision-makers would have minutes, not hours, to respond. President John F. Kennedy would have been faced with an irreversible choice: retaliate immediately or risk appearing vulnerable. Given the doctrine in place, retaliation would almost certainly have been ordered. The first hours of World War II would have been chaotic. American bombers would have crossed into Soviet airspace. Missiles would have launched from underground silos. Submarines would have fired from beneath oceans. Soviet radar systems would have detected incoming strikes. Retaliation would follow. Cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, New York, Washington, Chicago, and others would have been primary targets. Industrial centers would have been hit. Military bases across Europe would have been struck. NATO allies would have been drawn in. Warsaw Pact forces would have responded. The exchange would not have been surgical. It would have been massive. Estimates from the early 1960s suggested that tens of millions could die within the first few days. Infrastructure collapse would follow quickly. Power grids destroyed. Hospitals overwhelmed. Transportation halted. Communication systems shattered. Radiation would spread through the atmosphere. Fallout would not respect borders. Even nations, not directly targeted, would suffer consequences. Agricultural disruption could lead to famine. The global economy would collapse. And beyond the immediate devastation, there was the risk of escalation beyond the initial exchange. Tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe could have been used on battlefields. Allied and Soviet ground forces stationed in Germany were prepared for that possibility. Conventional war in Europe could rapidly turn nuclear. In Cuba, Soviet commanders had tactical nuclear weapons that could have been used against invading American forces. If the United States had launched an invasion following airstrikes, those battlefield weapons might have been used. That alone could have triggered immediate strategic retaliation. The terrifying reality was this: once nuclear weapons began to fly, stopping the exchange would have been nearly impossible. Communication systems might fail. Leaders might be killed. Command structures might fracture. Automated retaliation protocols could activate. The crisis planners in both Washington and Moscow understood this. That is why restraint mattered so deeply. That is why even after a U-2 plane was shot down on October 27, Kennedy chose not to respond immediately with force. That is why Nikita Khrushchev ultimately accepted a negotiated solution rather than risking further escalation. There is another dimension to consider: public awareness. In 1962, civil defense preparations existed, but they were limited. Some families had backyard shelters. Some cities had evacuation plans. But no system could protect millions from a full nuclear exchange. The psychological shock alone would have been overwhelming. The Cold War had conditioned populations to fear nuclear war. But living through it would have been something else entirely. Historians sometimes debate whether a limited nuclear war might have been possible in 1962. But the war plans of the era suggest otherwise. They were designed for decisive, large-scale destruction. Flexibility was minimal. Escalation was built into the structure. In later decades, strategies evolved to include more graduated response options. But in October 1962, once the threshold was crossed, the machinery of annihilation was prepared to move quickly and broadly. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not become World War III, but the plans for World War III were ready. Detailed, timed, practiced. The world survived not because it lacked weapons, but because those weapons were not used. If a single nuclear torpedo had been launched from a submarine, if an American airstrike had struck Soviet forces in Cuba, if a radar error had been misinterpreted, history might have divided into before and after October 1962 in a far more catastrophic way. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III was defined not only by what happened. It was defined by what almost happened. By the plans waiting in sealed envelopes. By the launch codes ready in safes. By aircraft circling silently above the clouds. By submarines hidden beneath the sea. All prepared. The 13 days at home. While leaders debated in guarded rooms and submarines drifted in silent darkness, ordinary people lived through October 1962 in a different way. They did not see classified photographs. They did not read decoded messages from Moscow. They did not know how close a submarine commander came to launching a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But they felt something. A pressure in the air. A pause in routine. On the evening of October 22, when President John F. Kennedy appeared on television to announce the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, families across the United States gathered in their living rooms. Television sets glowed softly. The speech was calm, measured, but unmistakably serious. Kennedy explained that nuclear missile sites had been identified just 90 miles from Florida. He announced a naval quarantine. He warned that any nuclear attack from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. The word war was not spoken recklessly, but it hovered between sentences. In the hours that followed, grocery stores saw unusual crowds. Canned goods disappeared from shelves. Bottled water sold quickly. Some families bought batteries and flashlights. Others did nothing outwardly, but lay awake that night longer than usual. School children sensed tension in their teachers. In some classrooms, discussions turned toward air raid procedures. Duck and cover drills were not new in 1962. For years, American schools had practiced what to do in the event of nuclear attack. Students had been taught to crouch under desks, to cover their heads, to face away from windows. By October 1962, Many children had already grown accustomed to the idea of atomic danger. But now it felt less theoretical. Parents spoke in lowered voices. Radio news updates were followed closely. In Florida, the tension was even sharper. Military convoys moved visibly. Aircraft flew overhead more frequently. Families near air bases watched as bombers departed with unusual regularity. Some believed invasion of Cuba was imminent. Some feared missiles might already be operational. In cities like New York and Washington, civil defense officials reviewed plans. Fallout shelter signs were visible in certain public buildings. Basements were inspected. Supplies were counted. But there was no mass evacuation. No sirens. Life continued. In the Soviet Union, citizens also followed state radio broadcasts. Information was more controlled. Official messaging framed the situation as American aggression. The Soviet Union, listeners were told, was acting to defend Cuba. But behind the confident tone, unease spread. Families who had survived the Second World War understood devastation. They knew what total war could mean. In Cuba, the atmosphere was even more immediate. Fidel Castro ordered full mobilization. Militias assembled. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned. Civilians prepared for possible invasion. Some dug trenches. Some moved valuables. Many expected bombing to begin at any moment. For 13 days, ordinary life operated under extraordinary uncertainty. Telephones rang more often. Neighbors discussed rumors. Newspapers printed daily updates with cautious headlines. Speculation filled conversations. Would ships clash at sea? Would missiles launch? Was this the end? Religious services saw increased attendance in some areas. Moments of quiet reflection multiplied. And yet, in many households, daily routines persisted. Children still completed homework. Factories still produced goods. Restaurants still opened their doors. The tension existed alongside normalcy. This dual reality, ordinary routine under existential threat, defined the experience of civilians during the crisis. Most did not know how close the danger truly was. They did not know about the submarine confrontation. They did not know about radar false alarms. They did not know how heated debates became inside executive meetings. They only knew that something serious was unfolding. When Radio Moscow broadcast Nikita Khrushchev's message on October 28, agreeing to remove missiles from Cuba, relief spread gradually. It was not instant celebration. It was cautious, measured. People waited to be certain. When the quarantine remained peaceful. When reconnaissance confirmed dismantling. When military alert levels slowly reduced. Then relief deepened. In American homes, televisions returned to regular programming. In Cuba, mobilization eased. In the Soviet Union, official messaging shifted tone. The world resumed its rhythm. But something had changed inside many families. For a brief period, the possibility of sudden annihilation had felt immediate. Not abstract. Not distant. Immediate. For children who lived through those days, the memory lingered. For parents, the awareness of vulnerability deepened. The Cold War had always existed in the background. Now it had stepped forward. The crisis did not leave visible ruins. No cities burned. No landscapes were cratered. But psychologically, it left an imprint. Ordinary citizens had brushed against the edge of history without fully seeing it. They had lived through 13 days when civilization's survival rested on decisions made far away. They went to work. They cooked meals. They tucked children into bed. All while the world stood at the brink. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III was experienced not only in command centers and diplomatic cables. It was experienced in quiet kitchens, in dim living rooms, in classrooms where students practiced drills, in neighborhoods where people watched the sky a little more closely. History often remembers leaders, but it is lived by ordinary people. And during October 1962, ordinary people carried on, unaware of how thin the line truly was. Information, propaganda, and controlled panic. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, information itself became a weapon. Not missiles, not submarines, but news reports, speeches, and public messaging. Control over perception mattered almost as much as control over territory. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy understood that public communication had to be measured carefully. If he revealed too much military detail, it could expose intelligence capabilities. If he revealed too little, rumors might fill the gap, and rumors spread fear faster than facts. His televised address on October 22 was designed with precision. He showed photographic evidence of missile sites. He explained the quarantine clearly. He avoided dramatic language. He did not call for panic. He projected calm authority. That tone was intentional. In crisis situations, leadership communication influences public reaction. A leader who appears unstable can amplify fear. A leader who appears steady can reduce it. Across the Atlantic, Nikita Khrushchev delivered messages through state-controlled media. Soviet newspapers framed the situation as American aggression. Radio broadcasts emphasized defense of Cuba. The narrative presented the Soviet Union as protecting a sovereign ally from imperialism. Domestic audiences received a unified message. There was little public debate visible in official outlets. In Cuba, Fidel Castro used similar messaging. Cuban media described mobilization as resistance. Citizens were encouraged to prepare for potential invasion. Propaganda reinforced solidarity. Each government shaped information to maintain stability at home. But outside official channels, uncertainty spread. International media played a crucial role. Television networks broadcast updates rapidly. Newspapers printed photographs of missile sites. Journalists analyzed naval movements. For the first time, people around the world could visually confirm elements of a nuclear confrontation as it unfolded. This visibility increased global awareness and sometimes amplified anxiety. Foreign governments monitored the crisis closely. Allied nations depended on American protection, but worried about becoming targets if war erupted. Neutral countries observed carefully, assessing whether alignment with either superpower increased or decreased risk. United Nations discussions became a platform for confrontation. American diplomats presented evidence of missile deployment. Soviet representatives denied aggressive intent while defending their actions as legitimate support for Cuba. Debates at the UN were intense but controlled. Diplomacy continued even while military forces remained on alert. One important factor during the crisis was censorship of certain information to prevent escalation. For example, details about the Soviet submarine confrontation were not publicly disclosed at the time. If the public had learned that a nuclear torpedo nearly launched after American depth charges, panic might have spread. Governments often limited sensitive disclosures during the crisis to avoid triggering public fear that could pressure leaders into harsher actions. Another communication challenge involved misinterpretation of signals. Military movements were sometimes misread by observers as preparation for attack. Aircraft patrols that were routine were sometimes perceived as escalation. Ships repositioning for defensive reasons were occasionally interpreted as offensive deployment. In an environment already charged with tension, perception amplified risk. Even accidental events could be misunderstood. On October 27, when a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba, initial reports created confusion. Some officials feared it might trigger immediate retaliation. Information had to be clarified quickly to prevent escalation based on assumptions. Speed of communication became critical. The absence of instant digital communication in 1962 meant that updates traveled through telephones, radio transmissions, and diplomatic messengers. Delays could create uncertainty. Uncertainty could create reaction. Reaction could create escalation. After the crisis ended, leaders recognized that faster and more reliable communication channels were essential. That realization contributed to the establishment of the direct hotline between Washington and Moscow. The hotline was not meant for public announcements. It was a private channel designed to reduce the risk that miscommunication would lead to catastrophe. Media coverage of the crisis also shaped its historical memory. Photographs of missiles being removed from Cuba became symbolic images. They represented resolution. They signaled success in avoiding war. Documentaries and later historical accounts emphasized the drama of those 13 days. Over time, the crisis became a lesson taught in military academies and political science courses. It became a case study in crisis management. It demonstrated how transparency, restraint, and controlled communication can prevent escalation. However, media coverage sometimes simplified the narrative. It portrayed the resolution as smooth and decisive. In reality, negotiations were messy. Messages overlapped. Demands shifted. Secret agreements played a role. The complexity behind the scenes was far greater than public broadcasts suggested. The Cold War demonstrated that information management is part of strategic stability. If leaders misjudge public reaction, they may feel forced into aggressive postures to preserve credibility. If media amplifies fear without context, pressure on decision-makers increases. Balancing transparency with caution became a key challenge after 1962. The crisis also influenced how governments prepared communication strategies for future emergencies. Officials recognized that immediate public explanation of military alerts could reduce speculation. Clear messaging reduced the likelihood that citizens would interpret routine defense actions as signs of impending attack. In retrospect, one striking feature of October 1962 is how controlled public messaging prevented mass panic. Although fear existed, it did not turn into chaos. Markets did not collapse. Governments did not lose domestic control. Societies remained stable under stress. That stability gave leaders space to negotiate. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III was not only a military confrontation. It was also a communication challenge. Success required careful words as much as careful strategy. In the nuclear age, information can either inflame tension or stabilize it. During the crisis, leaders learned that transparency combined with restraint can prevent misunderstanding from turning into war. And that lesson continues to influence global diplomacy today. Machines that watch the sky. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, technology played a silent but powerful role. Radar systems, spy planes, early warning networks, satellites, computers. These machines observed the battlefield of the Cold War and sometimes misled it. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy relied heavily on intelligence gathered through advanced surveillance. One of the most important tools was the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. These high-altitude planes flew far above enemy air defenses to photograph missile sites and military installations. It was a risky mission. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 flight captured the photographs that confirmed Soviet missile construction in Cuba. Without that technological capability, the missiles might have remained hidden longer. The discovery itself was not accidental. It was the result of systematic surveillance. Satellite technology was still in its early stages at the time. Most intelligence came from aircraft photography and signal interception. Film from the U-2 planes had to be physically recovered and developed before analysts could examine it. That process took time, but it provided clear visual proof. The images changed the course of history. Technology also played a defensive role. American radar systems monitored airspace for signs of incoming bombers or missiles. These systems operated continuously during the crisis. Operators watched glowing screens, scanning for anomalies. False signals sometimes appeared. Atmospheric disturbances, equipment glitches, bird flocks. But each alert required verification. On several occasions, radar systems suggested possible missile launches or aircraft movements that turned out to be false alarms. If misinterpreted, those readings could have triggered rapid military response. In an environment where nuclear forces were at maximum readiness, false detection carried enormous risk. Another crucial technological factor involved missile detection systems. In 1962, early warning satellites were not yet fully developed. Ground-based radar stations provided most detection capability. This meant that reaction time between detecting a launch and responding to it could be extremely short. Leaders needed confidence that warnings were accurate. But detection systems were not perfect. The possibility of technical malfunction always existed. The Soviet Union also relied on radar and observation posts to detect potential American attacks. During the crisis, Soviet radar operators monitored American air activity closely. They tracked reconnaissance flights. They observed aircraft carriers. They watched bombers take off. From their perspective, increased American military activity could have signaled preparation for invasion. Technological interpretation shaped strategic perception. Submarines were another technological dimension of the crisis. Both sides deployed nuclear-armed submarines capable of surviving a first strike and launching retaliation. These vessels were designed for stealth. Hidden beneath the ocean surface, they represented second strike capability. During the crisis, the presence of Soviet submarines near American naval forces created uncertainty. American commanders did not always know whether a submarine carried conventional weapons or nuclear torpedoes. This uncertainty increased caution. It also increased tension. One of the most dangerous technological moments occurred aboard the Soviet submarine B-59. American destroyers dropped practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface. The crews inside did not know the charges were signals, not attacks. Heat inside the submarine rose. Oxygen levels dropped. Communication with Moscow had been lost. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed war might already be underway. He considered launching a nuclear torpedo. But another officer, Vasily Arkhipov, argued against immediate launch. Because Soviet protocol required agreement from multiple officers, his refusal prevented the weapon from being fired. Technology provided the weapon. Human judgment prevented its use. This interaction between machine capability and human decision defined the crisis. Automation existed, but ultimate authority remained with individuals. Another technological concern involved command and control systems. Military forces needed reliable communication to transmit orders. If communication lines were disrupted, field commanders might interpret silence as authorization to act independently. That risk was especially dangerous with nuclear weapons. After the crisis, leaders recognized that secure and reliable communication between superpowers was essential. This realization contributed to the creation of the direct hotline between Washington and Moscow. The hotline reduced dependence on slower diplomatic channels. It allowed rapid clarification of intentions. Technology evolved partly because technology had nearly failed. The crisis also accelerated research into better early warning systems. Over time, satellite surveillance improved. Detection accuracy increased. Command systems became more redundant to prevent single-point failure. But even with improvements, technology remains imperfect. False alarms have occurred in later decades. Software errors, sensor glitches, human misinterpretation. Each incident serves as a reminder of how dependent nuclear stability is on accurate data. During October 1962, machines watched the sky. They observed ships, tracked aircraft, monitored missiles. But machines did not decide whether war would begin. People did. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III demonstrated that technology amplifies power and risk. It increases detection capability. It increases speed. It increases destructive potential. But it cannot replace human judgment. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, the interaction between technology and decision-making will remain critical. The global ripple effect. When the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, its impact did not remain confined to the United States, the Soviet Union, or Cuba. It reshaped global politics. It altered military planning. It influenced how nations viewed nuclear power. And it changed international alliances in ways that lasted for decades. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy emerged from the crisis with strengthened credibility in crisis management. He had resisted immediate military strikes. He had negotiated under pressure. He had combined firmness with restraint. International leaders observed this outcome carefully. Many concluded that measured diplomacy, even during confrontation, could produce results without triggering war. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev faced mixed consequences. He avoided nuclear war. He preserved the Soviet Union's relationship with Cuba. He secured the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. But within Soviet political circles, some viewed the crisis as evidence of strategic overreach. Critics argued that his risky gamble exposed weakness. 2 years later, internal party dissatisfaction contributed to his removal from power. The crisis thus influenced not only international relations, but domestic leadership stability inside the Soviet system. Globally, the crisis accelerated support for arms control. Governments recognized that unchecked nuclear competition increased danger. Negotiations gained momentum. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, restricting nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Although underground testing continued, this treaty marked a turning point. It was one of the first major agreements to limit nuclear escalation after direct confrontation. Many nations saw it as proof that dialogue could follow brinkmanship. The crisis also strengthened the logic of nuclear deterrence. Strategists concluded that deterrence worked, but only when communication was clear and retaliation capability was credible. Both superpowers increased investment in second strike forces. Submarines carrying ballistic missiles became central to strategic stability. Because they were difficult to detect and destroy, they ensured that no first strike could completely eliminate retaliation. This survivability reinforced deterrence. At the same time, the arms race did not slow immediately. Both nations continued expanding and modernizing nuclear arsenals. The fear generated by October 1962 did not eliminate competition, it reshaped it. Weapons development shifted toward reliability, accuracy, and survivability rather than sheer numbers alone. Beyond the United States and the Soviet Union, other countries observed the crisis carefully. China, France, and the United Kingdom evaluated their own nuclear strategies. Some nations accelerated independent nuclear programs, believing that possessing nuclear weapons provided security and diplomatic leverage. Others reinforced alliances with superpowers for protection. The crisis demonstrated that nuclear capability influenced geopolitical status. It also reinforced the importance of alliance networks such as NATO. European members of NATO relied heavily on American nuclear guarantees. After seeing how close confrontation came, those guarantees became even more central to collective defense planning. In Cuba, the crisis deepened the island's integration into the Soviet security framework. Although tensions remained between Havana and Moscow after the negotiations, the alliance persisted. Cuba strengthened its defensive posture. It remained aligned with the Soviet bloc throughout much of the Cold War. The global psychological effect of the crisis cannot be overstated. For leaders, it served as a permanent reference point. Future confrontations, whether in Berlin, the Middle East, or elsewhere, were measured against the memory of October 1962. Diplomats often asked during later disputes, could this escalate the way Cuba nearly did? That question encouraged caution. The crisis also influenced academic research. Political scientists developed new theories about crisis management, deterrent stability, and escalation control. Military academies studied the decision-making process in detail. The structure of executive committees, the role of back-channel communication, and the importance of controlled military readiness became subjects of analysis. In international law discussions, the crisis strengthened arguments for arms limitation agreements. It demonstrated that legal frameworks between adversarial states could reduce risk. Over time, more treaties followed. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, later agreements reducing missile counts. Each treaty built on the realization that stability required transparency and verification. Verification mechanisms became crucial. Satellite monitoring, on-site inspections, and data exchanges emerged as tools to ensure compliance. These mechanisms developed partly because trust alone was insufficient. The lessons of 1962 showed that clarity reduces suspicion. The ripple effects also extended into popular culture. Films, books, and documentaries portrayed the crisis as the defining near disaster of the nuclear age. Public memory preserved it as a warning. It became symbolic of humanity standing at the brink and stepping back. Generations born after 1962 learned about the crisis as history, but also as cautionary guidance. Perhaps one of the most important global consequences was this. The crisis established a shared understanding between superpowers that direct confrontation between nuclear-armed states is too dangerous to pursue lightly. Even adversaries recognized the necessity of crisis communication. Even rivals acknowledged the value of restraint. The Cold War continued for nearly 3 decades after 1962. Conflicts persisted. Competition endured. But the boundaries of escalation were clearer. The memory of October remained embedded in strategic thinking. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III produced a lasting transformation in global security architecture. It showed that survival sometimes depends not on victory, but on compromise. Not on domination, but on controlled restraint. And its ripple effects continue to influence international relations today. How history remembers the brink. Decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, historians continued to examine it from new angles. With access to declassified documents, secret communications, and memoirs from participants, scholars reconstructed the crisis in greater detail than was possible at the time. What emerged was a deeper understanding of how fragile the situation truly had been. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy was long portrayed as the decisive leader who forced Soviet withdrawal through firmness. Early interpretations emphasized American strength and strategic superiority. But later research revealed a more complex reality. Kennedy resisted pressure from military advisors who urged immediate airstrikes. He deliberately chose gradual escalation. He allowed space for negotiation. His decisions were not purely aggressive, they were calculated and cautious. At the same time, archival evidence showed that secret diplomacy and compromise, including the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey, played a crucial role in resolving the crisis. This revelation challenged simplified narratives. It showed that resolution required flexibility from both sides. In Moscow, documents released after the collapse of the Soviet Union provided insight into Nikita Khrushchev's internal debates. They revealed that Soviet leadership was not unified in support of missile deployment. Some officials warned that placing nuclear weapons in Cuba could provoke confrontation. Others believed it would strengthen bargaining power. Khrushchev ultimately approved the deployment, but later acknowledged privately that the risk had been extreme. His decision-making reflected both strategic ambition and political pressure within the Soviet system. These historical records confirmed that neither side fully understood how close they were to disaster. They also demonstrated that both leaders acted under incomplete information. Modern historians emphasize this point. Crises often unfold under uncertainty. Leaders make choices without knowing the full intentions of their adversaries. That uncertainty increases danger. The crisis is frequently studied today as a model of successful crisis management. Military academies analyze the structure of decision-making during those 13 days. diplomacy courses examine the back-channel negotiations that allowed face-saving compromise. Political science research often highlights three key lessons. First, communication reduces risk. The establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow directly followed the realization that slow diplomatic channels were dangerous. Second, controlled escalation creates negotiation space. Kennedy's quarantine provided pressure without immediate attack. Third, face-saving solutions enable withdrawal without humiliation. The secret agreement about missile removal from Turkey allowed Khrushchev to retreat while claiming gains. Modern leaders still reference these principles when managing international tension. Beyond academic study, public memory also shaped interpretation. Films dramatized the crisis with intense dialogue and suspense. Books explored the psychological dimension of brinkmanship. Documentaries featured interviews with surviving participants. The story became part of collective understanding about nuclear risk. Over time, new generations learned about the crisis not as active participants, but as observers of history. Yet its relevance did not fade. Whenever tensions rise between nuclear-armed states today, commentators often invoke October 1962. The phrase, "another Cuba," is sometimes used to describe moments of dangerous escalation. That comparison underscores how deeply the event remains embedded in strategic awareness. Another important aspect of legacy involves technological safeguards. After the crisis, improvements were made to early warning systems to reduce false alarms. Redundant communication channels were developed. Command authority protocols were refined to ensure clearer decision structures. Verification mechanisms in arms control agreements became more sophisticated. These developments were not automatic. They resulted from recognition that human error combined with technological failure could produce catastrophic outcomes. The crisis also influenced ethical debates about nuclear deterrence. Some scholars argue that deterrence prevented war by creating mutual fear. Others argue that relying on deterrence means living permanently on the edge of catastrophe. The Cuban confrontation provided evidence for both perspectives. It showed deterrence working because nuclear weapons were not used. But it also revealed how dangerous dependence on deterrence alone can be. Perhaps the most powerful element of its legacy is awareness. Awareness that nuclear war is not theoretical. Awareness that escalation can happen rapidly. Awareness that accidents and miscalculations are possible. Awareness that restraint matters. Today, international security discussions still reflect the lessons of that period. Leaders understand that transparency, communication, and verification are essential tools for stability. They also understand that crisis management requires patience and willingness to compromise. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III has become more than a historical episode. It has become a benchmark for evaluating risk in a nuclear world. It stands as a reminder that humanity's survival has at times depended not on technological superiority, but on deliberate restraint. History remembers October 1962, not because war occurred, but because it almost did. And because, at the decisive moment, leaders chose negotiation over destruction. The final lesson of the brink. When people look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis today, they often describe it as the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear annihilation through direct superpower confrontation. That statement is not exaggeration. It is supported by declassified documents, military records, submarine logs, and internal communications that reveal just how narrow the margin truly was. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy reflected after the crisis on how decisions were made under extreme pressure. He later acknowledged that some military advice during the crisis leaned heavily toward immediate force. He chose restraint instead. That choice shaped history. Kennedy understood something critical. Power without patience increases risk. Strength without communication invites escalation. His leadership during those 13 days became a case study in crisis management for future generations. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev also drew conclusions from the confrontation. He recognized that placing nuclear missiles in Cuba had exposed the Soviet Union to unnecessary danger. Although he secured some strategic gains, including the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey, the political cost within his government eventually weakened his position. His removal from power 2 years later reflected internal dissatisfaction, partly influenced by perceptions of overreach during the crisis. In Havana, Fidel Castro remained convinced that Cuba's security required strong defenses and alliances. He believed the outcome did not fully protect Cuban sovereignty because final negotiations occurred without direct Cuban participation. That frustration influenced Cuba's foreign policy alignment for decades. The lasting lesson from the crisis is not about victory or defeat. It is about survival through controlled decision-making. The world survived because escalation stopped before irreversible action occurred. It survived because leaders resisted immediate retaliation. It survived because compromise, even secret compromise, was accepted as necessary. Another essential lesson concerns misperception. Both superpowers misjudged elements of the other's intentions. The United States underestimated how strongly the Soviet Union valued strategic parity. The Soviet Union underestimated how firmly the United States would respond to missiles so close to its territory. Misreading an opponent's resolve or fear can dramatically increase risk. Modern crisis management systems attempt to reduce that uncertainty through communication channels, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic engagement. Yet uncertainty can never be fully eliminated. That reality keeps the lessons of 1962 relevant. The crisis also demonstrated that individuals matter. Large institutions, militaries, intelligence agencies, governments shape policy. But final decisions often depend on specific people at specific moments. The submarine officer who refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch. The president who chose quarantine over airstrike. The premier who accepted withdrawal instead of escalation. Those individual actions influenced global survival. History sometimes appears inevitable in hindsight. But October 1962 proves that outcomes depend on choices. Small differences in judgment could have produced catastrophic consequences. A delayed message. A misinterpreted radar signal. A different vote inside a submarine. Any of those variables might have changed everything. The Cold War continued after the crisis, but its character changed. Leaders operated under a clearer awareness of nuclear limits. Arms control efforts expanded. Communication improved. Military planning incorporated stronger safeguards against accidental launch. Yet the existence of nuclear weapons still carries risk. Technological systems remain complex. Human decision-making remains imperfect. That combination requires constant vigilance. Today, scholars and policymakers study the crisis not only as history, but as guidance. It teaches that crisis communication must be direct, escalation should be measured, diplomatic off-ramps must remain available, and adversaries, even in intense rivalry, must maintain channels for dialogue. The Cold War day that nearly started World War III stands as a warning engraved in global memory. It reminds humanity that advanced weapons demand advanced responsibility. It shows that survival in the nuclear age depends less on dominance and more on discipline, less on confrontation and more on control. The world came closer than most people realized. It stepped to the edge, and it stepped back. That act of restraint remains one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. And it continues to echo whenever global tensions rise.